Welcome to Dark Feed, where once you find the feed, it finds you. Let me tell you a story buried in the pines. A story soaked in silence, sealed by fear, and whispered by the wind between the trees. A real story, one the police never solved. One where the monsters were real and they were never caught. This is the story of Cabin 28. And what happened on the night of April 11th, 1981, in the forgotten town of Keddie, California. Keddie was one of those towns you drive through and forget. A fading rail stop buried deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains. By 1981, it had become a husk. Nothing but a few cabins, mostly run down, and a handful of residents stubborn enough or poor enough to stay behind. The Keddie Resort, once bustling with summer tourists, had become a home for people with nowhere else to go. Among them was Glenna Sue Sharp, a single mother, 36 years old, who had packed up her 5 children and left Connecticut after a painful divorce. She wanted a fresh start, something quiet. She moved into Cabin 28, a modest, isolated unit near the edge of the woods, the kind of place where the shadows fell early and the silence pressed in like damp air. Sue's family was doing the best they could. Her oldest son, John, was 15, the kind of teenager who wore trouble like a badge. Tina, her 12-year-old daughter, was shy and quiet, always tagging behind her younger siblings. Rick, 10, and Greg, 5. They went to school nearby. They lived poor, but they lived together. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was that someone was watching Cabin 28. Someone with cruel eyes. Someone who had no intention of letting them live in peace. April 11th, 1981. It was a Saturday. Spring hadn't quite settled in yet. The wind still carried the bite of winter through the trees. That night, Sue stayed home with Tina and the 2 youngest boys, Rick and Greg. John, her teenage son, had gone out with his friend Dana Wingate. They were hitchhiking back from Quincy, a nearby town. The night wore on. Cabin 28, barely lit by a dull bulb in the kitchen, settled into sleep. The forest outside was silent. And then, sometime after 10 p.m., something shifted. No one knows how many killers entered Cabin 28 that night, but they came prepared. They brought knives, they brought a hammer, and they brought a plan. What happened in that cabin is something even seasoned homicide detectives have refused to describe in full. But the aftermath told enough. The killers didn't break in. There was no sign of forced entry. That alone is horrifying. It means the door may have been unlocked. Or worse, someone let them in. Inside the main room, Sue Sharp was tied up with medical tape and electrical cords. She had been beaten, stabbed, and then gagged with her own underwear. Her throat was slit, so violently, in fact, that she was nearly decapitated. Beside her was John, her son, also bound, also beaten beyond recognition. His friend Dana suffered blunt force trauma so severe it crushed his skull. He was strangled. They had both tried to fight back. Their knuckles were torn. One of John's fingernails was found embedded in the floor. And Tina was just gone. Not dead, not hidden, just gone. The 2 youngest boys, Rick and Greg, slept through it. They were found unharmed, still tucked into the bedroom, unaware of the massacre that had taken place just feet away. Also in the house that night was Justin Smart, a young boy who had been staying over. Later, he would describe a dream, or maybe a memory of noises in the night. Screaming, a woman's voice crying out in terror, and blood. When the crime scene was discovered the next morning by Sheila, Sue's daughter, the horror was immediate and paralyzing. She had spent the night at a friend's house. She opened the door. She saw her family destroyed. She ran screaming. Local police responded, but they weren't prepared. They contaminated the scene. Evidence was lost, mishandled, ignored. They didn't even realize Tina was missing until hours later. The sheriff told reporters they were looking at a crime of overkill, a term that doesn't even begin to describe what was done in that room. Whoever did this wasn't just killing. They were sending a message. But to who and why? Rumors began to spread like wildfire. Was it a revenge killing? A drug deal gone wrong? Some said it was cult-related, that strange figures had been seen near the tracks. Others whispered about Sue, that maybe she knew something she shouldn't have. Then there were the suspects. Two men kept coming up. Both had ties to the Sharps. Both had histories of violence. Both were allegedly cleared by polygraph. And both were never officially charged. One of them lived just across the street, and his own son may have seen the murder. Yet somehow, in a town this small, the case went cold. People moved. Cabin 28 was eventually demolished, but the evil stayed. There is something particularly terrifying about an unsolved murder. It isn't just the lack of closure. It's the implication that someone is still out there, someone who got away with it. In the case of the Keddie murders, that fear never left. The trees still whisper. The cabin is gone, but the ground remembers. And every so often, when the wind comes down from the mountains just right, the story comes back. The blood, the silence, the missing girl, the killers that vanished like smoke. But this story isn't over, because what happened after the murders, the investigation, the cover-ups, and the bones that surfaced years later will make you question everything you thought you knew. Darkness doesn't always fall all at once. Sometimes it leaks in slowly, through silence, through failure, through fear. The Keddie cabin murders weren't just an unspeakable crime. They were a collapse of justice, of truth, of any sense of safety the survivors had left. This is what came after. After the screaming stopped, after the blood dried, this is the second act. And in many ways, it's worse than the first. April 12, 1981. The crime scene had barely cooled when mistakes began to pile up like bodies. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office was in over its head. Deputies with little homicide experience were suddenly faced with a triple murder and a missing child. They tried to secure the scene, but it was already too late. Officers allowed neighbors to enter. Paramedics walked through blood.
No perimeter. No gloves.
No real plan. The town of Keddie, remote and already suspicious of outsiders, watched in horror as the one shot at answers began slipping through their fingers. Tina Sharp was still missing. 12 years old. Quiet. Sensitive. No one could explain where she'd gone. The fact that 3 people were brutally murdered, but she had been taken, suggested something deeper. Something darker. Theories swirled. That she'd witnessed the murders and was kidnapped to silence her. That she was the intended target all along. That the killers had left the bodies in the cabin, but had taken Tina into the woods to finish what they'd started. Flyers were printed. Search dogs were brought in. Helicopters combed the tree canopy, but there was nothing. No blood trail.
No footprints.
No sign of Tina Sharp. The surviving boys, Rick, Greg, and Justin Smart, were questioned. Rick and Greg said they'd heard nothing. Justin, though, was different. Under hypnosis, Justin recalled something strange. He said he had seen Sue Sharp in the living room that night, talking to 2 men. One had long hair, a mustache. The other wore glasses. He said there was yelling, and then a violence. He said he saw Sue being struck. He said he saw Tina taken out the back door. It wasn't much, but it was something. Police created composite sketches based on his memory. The faces were haunting, especially for locals, because they looked familiar. There were 2 men in particular who raised eyebrows, and they weren't strangers. One was Martin Smart, Justin's father. The other was his close friend, Bo Bubaid, a man with a criminal record and alleged ties to organized crime. Martin lived just feet away from Cabin 28. He was known to be violent. He had a rocky marriage, and he had motive. You see, Martin's wife, Marilyn, had reportedly been close with Sue Sharp. Too close. Some said Sue had been counseling Marilyn to leave her abusive husband. Others whispered about jealousy, obsession. And then there was the hammer, the one used in the murders. a hammer that would vanish and reappear later in the most chilling way possible. When police questioned Martin, his story shifted constantly. He admitted he'd been angry at Sue. He admitted he had left the house that night with Bo. He claimed they had gone for a walk at 2 a.m. and then to a bar. He failed a polygraph test. Bo's test was deemed inconclusive, yet they were released. No arrests, no charges, nothing. And the strangest part? Martin's therapist allegedly told investigators that Martin had confessed to the murders during a session. If that's true, why wasn't anything done? Why did the sheriff's office bury it? Why were they allowed to walk free? In the months that followed, the case stalled. Evidence was misplaced. Witnesses were ignored. And Cabin 28, once full of life, sat rotting, dark, and empty. Tina's disappearance became a ghost that haunted every corner of Keddie. Until 3 years later, April 1984, a bottle collector, scavenging through the woods near Feather Falls, over 30 miles from Keddie, stumbled on something strange. A skull, small, fragile, still with a few strands of hair. Nearby, a child's blanket, a blue nylon jacket, and a pair of jeans. Authorities confirmed it within days. Dental records matched. It was Tina Sharp, 12 years old. Her body dumped in the wilderness, left to decay, and no one had seen a thing. The discovery reignited the case briefly, but there were no new leads. And just like before, the darkness closed in. The forest took Tina. The mountain took the truth. And once again, the killers slipped through the cracks. Years passed. People moved away. Some tried to forget. Others couldn't. Cabin 28 became a symbol not just of death, but of institutional failure. In 2004, it was finally demolished, torn down piece by piece. But the memories couldn't be erased. The pain soaked into the earth like blood into wood. And the people of Keddie never really healed. But there's one thing you should understand. A case like this, it doesn't just go cold. Sometimes, it's frozen on purpose. Files go missing. Evidence disappears. Witnesses recant. Confessions are ignored. And those with the most to lose stay quiet. But there were whispers, always whispers, that Bo Bubaid wasn't just a friend, but an informant, that the FBI told local authorities to back off, that this wasn't just murder, but a cover-up. The deeper you dig into Keddie, the darker it gets, and the bones are still buried. The most disturbing thing? Martin Smart died in 2000. Bo died years earlier. No charges, no justice, not even a formal accusation. And yet, people close to the case, former detectives, family members, still believe they know who did it. They believe the killers were protected, that the truth wasn't just lost. It was locked away. The forest around Keddie is thick, ancient, unforgiving. People who walk through those trees swear they feel something, a weight, presence, like the forest remembers, because the blood spilled in Cabin 28 never really dried. It soaked into the roots, into the earth, into the story, and it's still there waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to dig it up. Some stories don't end, they just rot. The Keddie Cabin murders should have been solved in 1981. The killers should have been caught. Families should have found peace. But none of that happened. Instead, silence. Silence from the police. Silence from the suspects. And silence from the mountain. But the dead don't stay quiet forever. And some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, claw their way back up. These are the whispers that remain. Let's go back. Not to 1981, but to everything after. Because the story didn't end with the blood in the cabin. It didn't end when Tina's skull was found in the woods. And it didn't end when the cabin was demolished. It lingered, in files gathering dust, in memories suppressed, in warnings whispered between locals who knew too much. It lingered in people like Marilyn Smart, Martin's ex-wife, who would later tell investigators that Martin had confessed to her that very night. He said, and I quote, "Ikiletsue," and Tina, "But I didn't have to do the boys." She claimed she told the police everything, and they did nothing. They let him walk, and she lived with that for decades, until she couldn't anymore. In 2008, something changed. A man named Josh Hancock began digging into the case. He was making a documentary and had gotten access to old case files. What he found disturbed him. Files were missing. Evidence lists didn't match the crime scene photos. Timelines had inconsistencies. Witness statements were altered or vanished completely. It was a mess, and it was no accident. Josh began interviewing former detectives, and bit by bit, a new picture began to form. One where Martin Smart and Bo Bubaid were not only prime suspects, but protected ones. Bo Bubaid had a long criminal record: burglary, assault. He'd worked as a Chicago enforcer. And most importantly, he was rumored to be an FBI informant. The theory? Bo had connections. He gave the feds what they wanted, and in return they shielded him, even from murder. That would explain the pressure put on the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. The sudden disappearance of key reports. The fact that leads dried up whenever they pointed toward Bo and Martin. In 2013, a new sheriff, Greg Hagwood, reopened the case, and what he found was horrifying. Inside an old evidence box, tucked away in a sealed envelope, was a piece of tape. On it, a recording, a 911 call never released. The voice on the tape was male. He claimed he knew what happened to Tina Sharp. He knew where she was. He begged them to check the Feather Falls area, exactly where Tina's skull would be found years later. This call was made before the remains were discovered. And yet, the tape was never followed up on, never cataloged, just buried. Like Tina, then came the hammer. In 2016, 35 years after the murders, a man doing renovation work near the Sharp property found something strange in a nearby pond. It was a hammer, rusty, heavy, matching the exact description of the missing murder weapon Martin Smart had reported to police in 1981. He told them, right after the murders, that one of his hammers had gone missing. Described it in detail. Now it had surfaced. It was still wrapped in fabric, still stained. It had been deliberately hidden, not discarded randomly, but planted, weighted down, meant to disappear, just like everything else. Then came the DNA. Modern forensic analysis revealed new samples on tape recovered from the scene. They were male, unknown, and did not match any of the surviving Sharp family members. They've never been identified, but they do match blood found on the steps leading out of cabin 28. Blood that didn't belong to the victims. Blood that bled out the back door, the same door Tina was taken through. The implication: one of the killers was wounded, and that blood still holds the key. There were other details too, sinister ones, like how the phone line to cabin 28 had been cut. But only after the murders began, meaning the killers didn't plan to lose control. Someone inside may have tried to call for help, and the killers realized it too late. Or how the bodies were posed. Sue was bound with tape and electrical cords, her head covered, a blanket draped over her. That's not random, that's personal. Whoever did this knew her, hated her, but also couldn't face her when it was done. That kind of rage only comes from betrayal, or love twisted into violence. There's one more thing. Justin Smart, the boy who claimed to have seen it all in a dream, later confessed something much darker, that he had been awake, that he had watched from behind the doorway, that he saw his father, Martin, hit Sue, that he saw Bo grab Tina, that he saw everything and said nothing. He was just a boy, afraid, frozen. But now, he's grown, and he remembers. The Keddie murders aren't just an unsolved crime. They're a failure, by law enforcement, by the justice system, by everyone who let it slide. And yet, the case remains open, technically. But justice? That door's been closed a long time. Too many years. Too many lies. Too many people dead. Martin is gone. Bo is gone. Sue is gone. John, Dana, Tina. But the truth? Still in the dirt. Still tangled in those pine roots. Still sitting in dusty file boxes in forgotten evidence rooms. Waiting for someone to listen. The forest around Keddie is quiet now. But every silence has an echo. The cabin is gone. The trees have grown taller. The scars are harder to see. But sometimes when the wind comes down the valley just right, if you stand where cabin 28 used to be, you can almost hear it. The creak of a screen door, a child's voice, a scream cut off too soon, and then nothing, just the cold and the knowing that they got away with it.